The first conversation we have with today speaks to our collective future, our future workforce and the sustainability of our economic growth. You know, for over 75 years now, CED's business leaders have been promoting and advocating investment in quality and access to all levels of education through our well-researched analysis and our outreach initiatives. In December of 16, CED received a generous education grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York to conduct a series of focus groups across the country, which we now have done. We engaged business leaders with parents in 5 states about workplace demands for high school graduates. And as part of our opening session today, CED is pleased to release our new report that highlights the findings and recommendations from these group discussions. The recommendations address increasing the effectiveness of business engagement in K-12 education and encouraging parents to demand the data and the support needed for future student success in the workplace. So copies of those reports should be at your chairs, and I hope that you get a chance to read all of that. We're very grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting this educational process and cultivating our understanding. In addition, we want to express our thanks to CED trustees Teresa Carlson, George Barrett, who is here, Greg Petersmeyer, who's here, and Lenny Mendoza for their assistance with the state partner coordination, as well as Chris Gabrieli, who helped with the focus group sessions. A related workforce publication that CED released last December was supported by the Nestle Corporation, and it's a discussion paper about apprenticeships. And we know that both of these papers will contribute to our discussion today. We're very fortunate to have with us 4 individuals who each have a different lens on the skills that workers need in the 21st century. Here to moderate the discussion is Chris Gabrieli. Chris began his career as the founder and CEO of GMIS, which is a medical software company. Earlier in his career, Chris helped entrepreneurs build a number of successful biotech and healthcare companies. Today, Chris is CEO of Empower Schools. He's chairman of the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education and a lecturer at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And our panelists include Nancy Danahy, Alan Morrison, and Mike Petters. Chris, I'm sure you will do a better and more deep introduction, and I'll leave it to you. Please welcome our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that. I was working on making sure I had name pronunciations right beforehand, and I have this opportunity to do research with my brother, who's a professor at MIT, and we did this big event on the governor's convening in Massachusetts on digital innovation. The president of MIT got up and hesitated because, oddly enough, my brother and I say our names differently. So on one side of the Cambridge, on one side of the Charles River, it's Gabrieli, and on the other side, Gabrieli. So you were safe. And where you went, Steve. So thank you for the generous introduction. I'm not going to read bios, but I am asking panel members to introduce themselves in the context and way they want. You do have biographies in your materials. You know, I think this is a great topic and a great kind of thing for CED to be doing. I'm a new member, but it's this kind of work that's really drawn me in. I have worked in education reform now for a little longer than I worked in my business career. In my 18th year in education reform after 17 years as an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist, so I'm kind of trusted by nobody. The business world, I'm like, you left a while ago, and in the education world, business guys, we know what you're up to. But one thing that really strikes me about the discussion education, and it's really struck me most since Governor Baker appointed me to be the chair of the Board of Higher Ed, because I had mostly worked in K-12 before, is how insular and introspective most of the discussion in the education policy world is, defined by priorities and beliefs of people from the education field, which is a field well worthy of respect. We all admire the great teachers we had. We all appreciate, or most of us appreciate, the college we went to or were able to send our children to. These institutions attract enormous philanthropy, including, I'm sure, from many in this room. We think well of them, but I do think if you challenge them to ask, what is the purpose of much of what you do, the answer tends to come back in a circular logic fashion, often remarkably disconnected to the experience students go on to have, particularly again in the higher education and workforce space as they go to work for employers. And as my kids have hit those ages, I've been struck by even the fanciest, most elite colleges kind of essentially punt on the question of where does this take you? What should you consider in your life? What kind of career could you have? How would any of this be relevant? How would you make that decision? And I mentioned my brother being an academic. I understand his point of view, which is he's not interested in getting into that messy business and career stuff, but almost all the students are. And if you look at something like the public higher ed system in a place like Massachusetts, overwhelmingly our critical customer, besides the students and the families themselves, are the employers in Massachusetts who have an expectation that we're preparing folks who can thrive as citizens, but also as employees. So I'm going to jump into this work. I think the CED study that you've got a copy of was really interesting. I had the chance to sit in on the Massachusetts listening tour, and I can boil down to one thing to say is what the parents said they wanted from, in this case, Westfield, Massachusetts, from the high schools their kids attended, and what the employers in the Westfield area said they wanted was not something that I believe that the Westfield School Board or the Westfield School Department would acknowledge was their domain to pursue. So let's get into it and talk about what employers' perspectives are. I'll just start with one anecdote from my own experience. When I started in the venture capital business, every company we funded, Silicon Valley, Massachusetts, et cetera, hired all the people right there. And they built their product and they started selling it wherever they could sell it in the United States. And if everything went great, somewhere down the road, someone said maybe we could sell some of this stuff overseas. And maybe then the overseas employees became relevant. I still see the deal write-ups from Bessemer Venture Partners, the firm I was part of. And I would say the vast majority of the startup companies now have an overseas staffing strategy at the get-go, both to get talent and cost-effective talent in Europe and Asia, in countries that I only know a little bit about, where the talent is proliferating in education systems that have been committed to helping those countries advance, and where smart young companies go after it. I think it's one of those classic examples of where the business world sort of sees what's changing in the world in a way that often the American policy discussion ignores. So that's just an anecdote from my own, and it certainly has inspired me to care a lot about what we're doing to give kids in Massachusetts and in our country the opportunity to compete for those jobs, because these are good jobs. These are well-funded companies doing cool stuff at the cutting edge. So I want to start with a couple of the employers and start with a much longer-standing CED trustee than me, which means he's 2 years, I believe, versus my one. And Mike is CEO of a really impressive large manufacturer of real things. They still exist in the United States, right?
Right.
A few hour and a half or 2 hours from here.
So I'm Mike Petters. I'm the CEO of Huntington Ingalls. You may know us as the company that builds Navy warships. We build nuclear ships and nuclear carriers and submarines in Virginia. We also build non-nuclear destroyers and amphibious ships down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And we have a services group, a technical solutions group that basically follows the Navy and other government agencies around the world to support what they do, translating what we do in our business, in our shipbuilding business, translating that to other customers who have a need for those kinds of capabilities. We are the largest employer in the state of Mississippi, and we are the largest site of manufacturing in the state of Virginia. And so we have 37,000 employees. So this whole central issue of workforce development is really the core of our business. We really describe the business as we're a workforce development company. We wrap it in shipbuilding, and then we have technical solutions to offer to other customers beyond that. And that's kind of the way we think about the business. We spend $100 million a year in education and training and workforce development. We run apprentice schools. We do craft training. We do it all. And so we have a pretty broad perspective on that. And I'll just leave it at that as a way of introduction and pass it on here.
Okay.
Nancy's EVP at Madison Square Garden and very involved in talent, not only there, but earlier in her career. And we were talking earlier about, these are impressive situations where you have the scale of employees you have at the various levels you all have. What are some of the things you see playing out, Nancy, in terms of both how well prepared people are and what an employer wants to do or has to do versus what the public responsibilities are in terms of higher ed, secondary, post-secondary education, high school education, and so on?
I mean, listen, I think employees or potential candidates are very much better prepared now than they have been in the past. We actually, when I think about our pipeline of talent, and it starts at a junior level, I'm here with a group of colleagues, and one of them in particular, Lauren Ferris, leads our Student Associate Program. And we've seen about a 34% increase in the number of applicants that have come through. I mean, for us to have 67 slots on a summer basis, we've got 4,000 plus applicants that apply for the roles. And it's competitive. I mean, we work in a really fun industry with Madison Square Garden. We are a sports and entertainment company that is based in New York, LA, Chicago, and expanding into different parts of London and Vegas. And people associate with sports, they associate with our brands, and they want to be part of working for a really cool company. So I find that, you know, a lot of the students, the incoming students, are incredibly well prepared, probably more so than the middle management executives, I'll say. I think that sometimes they may take things for granted a little bit more, and I see that the younger generation is really prepared for coming in for a really solid interview and experience.
Mike, one more question for you before I turn to Mansour and talk about sort of the higher ed perspective. But, you know, $100 million is an impressive number to be spending on workforce training. And some of the things you mentioned, like apprenticeships, obviously kind of uniquely can only be done by the employer. What's your when you think about the balance, though, between what an employer should be doing and can do and what higher ed and high schools ought to be doing? What's your feeling on what's getting done well? It's great to hear from Nancy that there's such a competitive applicant pool, although Madison Square Garden sounds like probably things my kids would want to apply to do too. So I mean, there's a little bit of a competitive advantage there.
Right, absolutely.
I'm going to go get an application when we get done. You know, my sense of this, it's because we're the largest employer in 2 states. We're pretty wired into the state workforce development efforts, whether it's K through 12 or community colleges or higher education. And I mean, our leaders are on speed dial with the governors when we start talking about workforce development. I think of it as a pipeline of, you know, you actually start training someone to be an employee when they're pre-K. And they start working their way through the pipeline, and they come out on the other end, and they're either ready to be employed or they're not. And a lot of the discussion right now is, you know, businesses are kind of sitting at the end of the pipeline, and they're looking at the product that's coming out there and saying, I'm not sure I can really use that product, you know? And so, you know, for us, that's not a new problem. I mean, there are very few places that you can actually come out of high school or come out of a college and say, okay, I'm a shipbuilder, you know? And so for nearly 100 years at Newport News, we've had an apprentice program that recognized this and said, you know, when you come inside the gate, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to train you so that you can be a shipbuilder. And we have, at Newport News, we have a 4-year apprentice program that is on the clock, on the job, in the classroom. When you finish that 4-year program, you're within reach of an associate's degree, and you're on your way to a bachelor's degree. That's not the be-all, end-all solution for workforce development. But what I think we've learned in this whole process is that the more that companies can engage in that pipeline further up than the output, the more likely they are to be happy with the result that comes out. And we go, because our business, you know, we're doing work on a ship today that we will deliver in 2027. We will refuel it in 2052, and we'll defuel it in 2077. So we've got a pretty reasonable horizon out there to think our way through on this. And so we're investing in the preschools. You know, we believe access to early childhood education is the way you get this started. And our experience in shipbuilding is that if you want to fix a problem at the end of the pipeline, it's really expensive. If you want to fix it at the beginning of the process, it's really cheap. And so our view is let's get after the early piece of this. Get our kids to actually fall in love with learning, because the kids that will grow up to be employees, to be successful in the 21st century, are going to be those folks who actually love to learn. the thing that they know when they graduate from high school or community colleges or colleges, what they have at that point is not going to carry them for the 40 years of their career. And if they love to learn, they'll be wildly successful. And if they have an aversion to it, then they're going to be a challenge.
So you're you're part of that supply line, a little past the preschool phase, being a Thunderbird School of Global Management. But love to get your sense of how it looks. You know, you're closer to, by the nature of the school you're at, you're closer to the workforce end of people's lives, but very much in the academic community. How have you adapted and are adapting to these needs today?
I was delighted to hear Mike's comments about integrating educational systems and what the companies do. But I want to give you a little bit of overview of what's going on in business education, business school industry. There's a lot of change happening. And the reason these changes are happening is because of you people and your companies. The challenge to us as business schools is how do we prepare our students to be able to start functioning effectively for you as employers. Now, traditionally, academic institutions have kind of kept their value system, their value chain separate from employers, etc., academics doing their own thing. That is not going to work anymore. So we at Thunderbird are going through a major review of what it is that we're producing. And that's happening at many other business schools because the needs of employers are changing. So I'll share with you a few things about the process that we're going through. We've been trying to understand the realities of employers. What is going on? What's happening in the organizations? The issue of speed of decision making, flexibility, adaptability, agility. All of those are important to us in the sense that we need to figure out how do we prepare these students for that kind of environment. So the curriculum is being revised, but it's actually going beyond the curriculum. We're now looking at our system of education as not just a bunch of courses, but as a journey. So what kind of a journey can we create for our students by the end of which they will be more ready to do what the employers need? So one of the major challenges to us as a business school is how can we minimize the boundary between practice, the world of practice, and the world of education and teaching in the classroom. So Mike's point about integrating the value chains, this is where our minds are exactly. How can we bring in the employers into the process of educating our students to make sure that our students learn the theories, the methodologies, develop the cognitive complexity that you need, but at the same time are globally ready, are ready for the world of practice. So that is our challenge, and that's what we're focused on right now.
One thing that comes out in this study I'd love to ask all three of you about is, and it was very clear in the one of the 5 listening tour visits I sat in on, was that a place that both parents and employers agreed on was that yes, the core academic skills and the specific technical knowledges and so forth are crucial, and people understand that the world's gotten more complicated and more demanding in almost every job role. But there was also this strong sense and concern about whether it was being effectively done, that students need to develop a set of, I think the report calls them soft skills, but I would say what I heard was people talking about really 2 classes of things. A set of pretty tangible skills that the academics would call intrapersonal skills, conscientiousness, reliability, grit, determination, and a growth mindset, those, and interpersonal, which we all know about in terms of the issues of being able to communicate and work well with teams. That those are very real skills, as well as concerns, I'd say, about character. I think the report actually talks about both groups wanting people to be good people, not something you normally find in a kind of dry workforce development analysis. But the parents really were concerned about whether their kids were, developing the kind of character they'd like to see them have. I think probably every parent worries about that. Speaking for myself, and not saying anyway, kids are particularly troublesome. But also the employers were also focused on that in an interesting way, that sort of intangible character quality beyond those kind of valuable direct skills. How do you all think about that in terms of either how you, identify people or how you develop people on that dimension?
I think it's the key. I think it's really, really important. It's one of the things that differentiates a person that makes it through the hiring process to someone that doesn't. I think there's skill sets, and then there's EQ. The soft skills are incredibly important for us. When I think about the full-time, higher-end role that some of our leaders play in dealing in the media space with very powerful people and their ability to manage those events, manage those individuals, and that is a skill set. You have to have a business savvy, and you've got to have the business mindset, but you also have to have the EQ soft skills in order to engage, and then the detail orientation to make sure that those events go off without a hitch and that everything goes as perfect as it's supposed to. That's on our full-time side, where we hire like 400 people a year. On the part-time side for us, from an hourly perspective, that's about your guest experience. So, that skill set is equally as important to us. We hire about 2,000 people a year. It's about a 10,000 person workforce strong. And that group they're responsible for making sure that you get your hot dog cooked on time, and that your French fries come out, and that you get served with a smile. And that is EQ. And one of the things that we are really faced with, especially in New York, is unemployment, the fact that we have a low graduation rate from students coming out of high schools, out of colleges, and the skill sets that we require for people to actually work in our venue population. They have to have a strong analytical background, or at least some level of analytical capability, because we give them performance feedback based on the analytics of how they perform within the garden. So I think those soft skills, you can teach people to do a variety of different things, but it's hard to teach someone who just intrinsically isn't a good person to be nice to someone. And the niceness matters, right? It does. So,
They're listening.
Yeah, so if niceness is a word, it's something that we really look for.
Mike, how do you think about that in your context?
So, we're hiring, at this point, in our Virginia site, we're hiring 400 people a month. And most of those folks are not going to require college degrees. And most of those folks are going to go on to do some craft training and become welders or painters or fitters or do something like that. And we're also hiring in Pascagoula, not quite at that rate, but it's the same sort of thing. Our majority of our folks that are going to be hired are going to be coming in kind of in the craft side of our business. What I would say is that, there's kind of two levels of workforce development that I've seen kind of start to break out. One is this craft level of what do you need, and then the other level is the higher education piece of it, where you're going to have senior management, senior engineers, and quality engineers, things like that. I absolutely believe that the parents are onto something here, that these social skills and soft skills are critical after you're in the business. I'm not sure that we employers really know how to test that before you in your interview or in the application. I'm not sure there's not an SAT for soft skills anywhere that you can put a number up. But what I can say is that it doesn't take very long inside the organization for the organization to figure out whether you got it or you don't. And in our organization with 37,000 people across the world, we have 5,000 leaders. And the task that we give our leaders is create a culture where your least empowered person is confidently contributing to your success. Now, you can't do that if you don't have the soft skills. And, you know, and this empowerment, empowering our people, empowering the welder to say, you know, I'm going to do it the way the drawing says, but, you know, there's a better way to do this. I mean, that's the engagement we want to capture. And your only way you're going to get that is not by having the smartest welder become the supervisor. It's going to be by having the person with that leadership craft, those soft skills that go along with that. They're the ones that are going to be able to entice that sort of engagement out of people. We don't have the customer-facing piece of the business that you have in the sense of a retail customer, consumer customer. But in our business, it's about teamwork. It's about having the welders and the fitters and the painters all kind of coordinating with each other. You don't paint it before you weld it. I mean, you know, stuff like that. And so this ability to work together as a team and create teams and build teams is something that, you know, we absolutely subscribe to, and it's frankly part and parcel to what we tell our leaders they have to do.
Mansour, talk about how you think about that at Thunderbird and what you see going on in education in general to address that.
You know, Chris, I find it interesting that we call them soft skills because they're actually very hard to develop. So I don't know where the soft comes from. As you heard from Nancy, it is hard to develop. But let me complicate it even further for you. We need to develop people who can work effectively with other people. But now these other people aren't just another bunch of Americans. Now your employee has to deal with the Japanese, the Russians, the Argentinians, who happen to be on a global team working together as colleagues, as suppliers, as partners. So what means being nice to an American may actually be interpreted as being unnice to an Argentinian. So how do you teach, how do you develop the students to understand that you need these so-called soft skills, but the application of soft skill can be different in different parts of the world? I'll give you an example. When McDonald's started their huge business stores in Moscow, they had a very serious problem. It was not a technological problem. It was not a strategic problem. The problem was how to get the Russian employees to smile to the client, to the customer. Because in the Russian culture, people do not smile to strangers. In fact, I was having a meeting with a group of Russian executives, and I asked them about this. What's going on with smile?
You might be the only person in Washington acknowledging you're having meetings.
Well, being an academic, I have more freedom.
Okay, all right.
And one of these Russian executives made a comment that was fascinating to me. He said, look, if we see someone walking on a Moscow street smiling, we think he's either American or crazy.
Or
So-
both.
Or both.
Aren't they both?
Could be both. So the notion, a simple notion of smiling to someone can be interpreted so differently. Now, this didn't used to be a problem 30 years ago when your employees didn't have to interact on a daily basis with people from all over the world. But now they do. So our challenge as business schools is bring both the cognitive side of education, which is the functions, the finance theory, all the production methodologies, etc., but at the same time create experiential opportunities, create all kinds of other ways of developing the social side of the person. We need to produce a complete person, not someone who only knows finance or only knows marketing, but someone who knows finance and who can work effectively with a bunch of other finance people all over the world. That's our challenge, and it's really hard. And by the way, one of the requirements is the professors themselves have to not just have the cognitive understanding, but the emotional side too, the interest, the passion. Because if they don't have it, they're not going to share it with their students. and that education will be incomplete.
If I could
Yeah, please.
just add in, if I could just add in on that, you know, you were talking before, and the question is kind of how do we get these things more aligned? You know, one of the things that we have done is we've gone into the high schools and we've taken teachers in the high schools and we brought them during their summer breaks. We brought them in and actually put them in our shipyards for 2 or 4 weeks so that they can actually see the work. And what that does, it has absolutely changed the attitude in the classrooms, because now you have, you know, 25 years ago, the mentality was, you need to pass my class or else you'll have to go to work in that shipyard. The attitude today is, you have to pass my class so that you can go to work in that shipyard. And those teachers are now able to, in an environment where, especially on the STEM side of things, maybe, I'm not sure I've seen it quite yet on the business side of stuff, but on the STEM side of things, there's a whole lot more focus on project-based learning, right? You build teams and you go do projects together. Engineers, the great engineering schools are all doing this now with PBL, and they're doing a lot of this. And so these kids that are coming out of those programs are actually getting a chance to try things out before they come into our work environment. And everything we do in our work environment is project-driven and project-based. And so if you have a teacher now that is engaged and sitting there thinking about, how do I get my kid, I'm teaching trigonometry, how do I get them to care more about this? Well, I just spent 2 weeks looking at how they do cranes and forklifts and lift things, and they have to figure out moments and they have to figure out angles. Maybe I can create projects around that will actually get people more engaged in it. We've seen that actually has great benefit. As we're sitting here, I'm thinking, you know, what we really need to do is we need to go and get professors from business school to come in and sit in our place for a couple of weeks at a time, so they can connect what they're trying to teach with what we really need to have.
Yes.
I can't help but comment, you know, on this issue that really jumped out when I saw the report of this wide interest in these. I agree with you, Mansour, not calling them soft skills. I tried to propose that edit, but properly the staff here said, well, that was the term used, so we're going to stick with it. So can't be the report you wanted to write. It must be a report that actually heard from folks. But it is a really interesting issue that I feel, again, this is a good example where I'd say inside the education community, for understandable reasons, there's been this extreme focus on the question of whether we're getting the literacy and math skills we need. And we aren't, and it's a big problem. But I think it has come, you know, clearly at the exclusion, particularly I think in K-12, of any focus on the question of, are we doing things as a project-based learning example, you know, that address those? And there are some people working to measure those things. There's 10 districts in California, 1 million students, who were one of the few groups that were creative in the pre-ESSA era that's the federal legislation around how schools have to be measured, and are actually measuring non-cognitive skills of their students and reporting it back to every school. There's some really interesting findings. Schools that have some of the most value added in the academic subjects are not necessarily schools that have the most value added on things like growth mindset. They're both important. This isn't about saying one or the other. They're both important. But if you don't even, in business, one thing we know is if you don't measure it at all, you know, it's going to be happenstance at best if it gets addressed. Once you start measuring it, different example, the PISA exam, the International Assessment of Different Countries' Performance by OECD, this time included an online task to try to measure an element, at least, of people's ability to work with somebody else. There's actually a software agent on the other end. It's not a person, but appears to be a person. And how well you go about trying to solve a problem with a person on the other end of the line was scored. And it's all on the PISA website. Interestingly, and here's a good sign from anywhere, a positive person, Nancy, it's important to keep the positives going. Americans way outscored many other countries, including in particular Chinese students, who way outscored us on math. Yes. We way outscored them on the ability to do collaborative problem solving. And I think we kind of all know that sort of, not that every person is, but that's kind of an American strength. And we all kind of inherently get that a school system that only rewards performance on a test that you take alone with yourself, and is a test that determines the rest of your future, as many other countries do, is one that's going to select for a certain attitude and approach and set of skills quite different, you know, than what you were talking about. So I think it's something I would encourage everybody in this room to get engaged in your state communities. There is a belief that business people only care about the math and science and language skills of students, and that is just not what most employers say. As much as there's a minimum requirement there, I don't want to. So again, I'm not saying one or the other. I think we're supposed to go to the audience for questions. Am I right about that? As the moderator, I'm supposed to know that. I think. So I've got plenty more to ask, and I bet our panel has stuff, but I also think it's fun when you get people engaged, whether it's a comment or a question. So does anyone have the, yes, sir? I think they're making their way towards you. And it would be always helpful if you wouldn't mind identifying your role in life.
Thank you very much. Bal Das from BGD Holdings. Delighted at the conversation we are having. Curious about one thing. As I see it, one of the things that struck out to me from the report is the parents' desire to inculcate in their children the desire for lifelong learning. To me, it seems to be, in some of the businesses I'm involved in, one of the most profound parts of developing the intermediate range workforce, because some of the things we see are deeply transformative, and some we have an understanding of, some we do not, whether they are driven by AI or whether they are driven by automation. Curious, as you training people in the shipbuilding industry, are you also working towards encouraging that element of it? The desire towards building lifelong learning couldn't be more important now than in most preceding periods.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and good to see you again. First of all, I would say one of the really, this is a kind of a from the left field bleachers perspective of education, not being on the field as an educator, not having to deal with all of the things that are there. My observation of it is that there's a lot of confusion in the educational system today about who the customer is, right? I mean, if you'll hear that the parents are the customers, or companies like mine are the customers. There'll be stakeholders. Maybe it's the teachers. Maybe we need to tailor things so that the teachers, and I've kind of come to the view, as radical as it might be, is that the real customers of education are the students, and that the product that's being delivered is by the teachers. And so all of the other stuff that we do around that, from a policy standpoint or anything else, if it starts to get in the way of a teacher actually being able to deliver high quality content to his or her customer, then I think that we're overthinking it a little bit. What we believe is that you really do have to start this teaching the kids how to be customers of their education. You got to do that very early. And so we've actually started a program in our business where children of employees that are 4 years old can apply for early childhood preschool scholarships. And the idea is to create more access for those kids into the pipeline, if you will, and get them started earlier than they otherwise might have. Left to its own devices, the kids, that same OECD report, the PISA report, talks about where we stand. We're 5th in the world in terms of early childhood education expense. We're 28th in terms of outcomes. We are the world average for pre-K education is something like 85% of students or something like that. In the US, it's down in the 50s or 60s. It's creating access to early childhood and then creating quality early childhood programs is one of those things that is a huge step forward in terms of changing the way we think about education. We do that because it not only does it give our the children of our employees an opportunity to get started early and become. It also my wife has been a preschool teacher for about 20 years, so there's a safe harbor parochial view of this. But what I find in talking with her is that she's evaluating the kids, but whenever there's a parent-teacher conference, what she's actually doing is she's counseling the parents. You know, she's teaming with the parents to deal with whatever they're trying to deal with in the classroom. She's talking to them about how they can be better parents and more engaged and more productive and more constructive. And it's done in the context of this is what Jimmy is doing in school, but it's actually it's as much about parenting as it is about education. And so our view is, let's get those kids into that environment. Let's get them moving in that direction. We tell people when they work for our company that being a parent is the most important job they have. And so that's kind of the way we think about that. As we go forward and we bring somebody out on the other end of the pipeline and they're going to work for us, we make it very clear that, you know, the nature of our work is such that you got to be qualified to do the job. You know, we're pretty strict about the qualification. You can't go down and do welding on a nuclear reactor unless you actually are qualified to be a nuclear welder, right? And so we track that pretty closely. And so we kind of have a DNA in our business about, okay, who's qualified to do this job? Am I qualified? What do I have to do to get qualified? And the successful folks in our business are the ones who not only understand what qualifications they have or need, but they also are able to figure out what qualifications their team needs and how they can get their teams ready to be successful. And so that is constantly reinforced every single day just by the normal business activity that we have.
I can't help but also feel, though, that your question, you know, and the way you deal with your workforce speaks to this, but that's the employer side of it. Our education and workforce training system today is much more oriented, really, the education side, towards what Ted Mitchell was the Undersecretary of U.S. Education in the past administration and now is the head of ACE, which is one of the main membership groups of higher ed, calls the inoculation theory. We all went through this. You go 4 years of college, you're inoculated for life. You're an educated person, right? Which is zero the experience in the workplace that people really get. But it is the model under which education operates largely, and by the way, is financed. So I think some of the real recommendations that CED has brought forward for Higher Education Act reauthorization, and some of the interesting things that are being discussed in Congress really speak to sharing the benefits of things like Pell Grants on a broader basis, recognizing that people need to learn throughout their lifetimes. Governor Baker and I in Massachusetts have been really pushing the opportunities for digital innovation to really change lifelong learning. We have the most educated state in the country. A little over half of all the people in Massachusetts in the labor workforce have a 4-year degree. That's a big advantage competitively, but it also means another half don't. And the question we've been pushing our higher ed institutions in are, what are you offering them? And why are you slow to adopt some of the new, more technologically mediated approaches that allow people to learn far more at the pace that they can, you know, at much more cost effectively and much more in smaller units. So we help Partners Healthcare, for example, develop with Southern New Hampshire University a certificate program that allows all their 70,000 employees now to get a first level certificate that stacks towards an associate's if they want to keep going for it. Sounds like some of what you were talking about in terms of stacking towards it, right? But I do think we have to challenge our higher ed institutions who are kind of comfortable with the old inoculation model. A bunch of 18-year-olds show up, you cash the check, you know, hold the courses, you know, and that's our job. And later on, we'll charge you for, you know, if you want to come back and spend 6 weeks in the summer, we'll do continuing education courses you can also pay for. That's a really different, I think, model of responsivity. And while I admire employers who do it, I think we have to challenge, not every employer is in a position to spend $100 million or do what some large, you know, really thoughtful employers do.
But the day will change. I mean, what's going to happen to me, in my mind, higher ed will wake up one day and they'll find out that I'm willing to accept, you know, Sally, who has gone through the 12 programs, the 12 steps to be qualified to be a manager in my company, doesn't have a college degree, but did this massive online course, and suddenly the Joe over at UVA doesn't have an opportunity. And when you, I mean, you're starting to see some of that now, you know, but behind that, what has to happen is, frankly, some of our laws and regulations around labor have to change. You know, the last time we had any sort of labor law passed in this country was 25 years ago. And back then it was, you either have a degree or you don't have a degree, and basically all of the exempt, non-exempt rules that were in play back then, I mean, those are all basically rearview mirror stuff for us now. And they're not really pertinent to what we're trying to get done now. They still drive a lot of those kind of artificial decisions that we do, but you know, to me, if you want to start talking about how you change the connection between, from a national policy standpoint, you got to go take a hard look at how we do labor law.
Nancy, I'm curious whether at Madison Square Garden or in previous work, whether you've had some opportunities to look at sort of other credentials, not just traditional 2 and 4 years, but certificates or other things, and how you think about access people have, maybe more on your full-time staff, to lifelong learning.
It's important to us. If someone has a 4-year degree, I mean, it's some of our minimum requirements. I'd love to say that we are doing, I think it's really amazing that you and your company have gone into schools and really partnered with teachers. I think that's outstanding. I think that's a great takeaway for us from like, how do you really start to identify talent at a really young age and get them inspired to go into that sort of industry. But not so much. It really comes down to, I have to say some of the more traditional things that we look for. We do look for people that have a minimum education. We love to see people who've had some really nice experiences with some different types of organizations. It's really the on-the-job learning that makes that person the right match for us. And then there's an element that I talked about earlier, the soft skills are what, really is just the culture match. And are they the right type of individual to come and work in this type of industry where it's incredibly fast-paced? What seems to be it's not so much on the education side, but what seems to be the thing that works for us is people that have worked in a very large organization, matrixed, work through the complexities, collaboration, and then go on and work someplace that's maybe a startup or more nimble. You have to be more nimble and more agile and work in where you don't have all the resources, and that's what seems to be the right recipe for us. And then, back to the student associate program, we've seen just a natural evolution of the business actually looking for students who are coming from have their master's in whatever that their specialty may be in. And that's just organically happened. The 4-year degree was really great about 1.5 years ago. Now the business is asking that we have candidates and we hire people that have master's degrees. And it's just organically happened. It's just been really interesting to sort of see the evolution. And I have seen that in my past in other organizations where that master's and that advanced education makes a really big difference. I also see how it's applied when the person actually comes into the business. I think that they're able to contribute in a much more thoughtful way. They may have, I love the connection between like finance and the master's side or an MBA, because then you're really integrating yourself into the business in a way that maybe someone who hasn't had that type of education isn't.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name's Paul Haskin. I'm with CBRE, a leading global real estate company across the globe. Thank you, panelists. Fascinating topic. I also sit on the National Advisory Council for an organization called VEI, Virtual Enterprise International, which teaches rising high school students throughout the public school system around the world, entrepreneurship. And one of the greatest challenges these students have is they run a virtual business for 1 year, and they fill out a C-suite, and they do their finance and marketing and human resources, and it's fascinating to see these students who are seniors in high school gather that experience and run that virtual business. However, the challenges are that teachers are not necessarily able to teach the skills of entrepreneurship and business. And that is one of our most important pieces of the agenda for this coming calendar year, is to educate teachers as to how to teach those entrepreneur skills. So that's my first comment, and if anyone on the panel has any suggestions to that, I would love to hear that. The second is comment. We've spoken about the young workforce coming out, graduating from college and so forth. Yesterday, I received a very upsetting call from a gentleman who was running the marketing department for 25 years from MLB. And unfortunately, there were some recent layoffs within the last 10 days, and he was let go. And this is a gentleman who has a lot of experience, successful in his career, gave heart and soul to MLB, and obviously he's decompressing, and this took place within the last 7 days. So, and our workforce is certainly working older. I don't think 65 is the common age of retirement any longer. People are going well beyond that. And here's a gentleman in his early 50s. And I was wondering if you would comment, in addition to the young workforce coming out of college, there's this middle-aged workforce that has, I think, a number of soft skills that sometimes our youngsters do not, because of the mobile texting and so forth that goes on, and how we could utilize that workforce as well. Thank you again.
And sir, I don't know if you've got some comments on either of those,
Yeah, I'll start.
or a
on
job
the,
for his buddy.
That
That would be dramatic.
Yeah, that part I leave to the other members of the panel. But on the entrepreneurship side, you talked about high school level, but we in business schools have a similar challenge in the sense that business schools want to provide the tools, the knowledge, the experience, the expertise to students to help them become entrepreneurs. Now, that doesn't mean every professor can teach that. So the way that we have tried to deal with this issue is we either find professors who themselves have started business. They're academics, but also they've been involved in startups, etc., so they can bring the world of practice and education together. But for those other professors who do not have that kind of background, we try to bring the real world into the classroom. So through the venture capital networks, the entrepreneurs in the community, you turn it into an almost team teaching concept where the teacher provides some skills and tools, but then the student learns from the reality of all the other members of the educational team who happen to be experienced in the real world of entrepreneurship. I wonder to what extent that is feasible at the high school level, but I don't see why not. So that's been our approach in business schools.
I can't help but want to comment when you mentioned the high school issue. I mean, we are lucky at CED to have a great team on this education side, Cindy Cisneros and Monica Herc, who do, I think, a really outstanding job. I know they've been thinking about kind of a lifelong learning strategy that would look much more deeply at the full pipeline, from the early ed considerations you bring out, where the soft skills, the preschool projects data is actually all mediated through soft skills, not through academic skills. So, you know, what is the whole pipeline? But I think one of the hardest questions, and I think many of you in your own states probably face this, is high school. High school is kind of a train wreck right now, and a lot of people are really pushing hard to move it more towards what people call these pathways orientations, where there's inherently far more focus not on completing a set of courses that you've acquired the skills at younger when you're through, but much more getting on a pathway at that age. And whether that's more of a career-oriented pathway that might end up, you know, in your firm, or whether it's more of a career and college or college-oriented sequence, but really starting to get that. And that means high schools have to start to open up to the outside world. Again, not this idea of internal decision-making as the only item. And those entrepreneurial skills, which are in some part soft skills as well, right? They're attitudinal and approach skills, suddenly become relevant to the curriculum. Most high schools today would say, to your comment, we have a pretty set curriculum we have to follow that's very traditional academic in its sequence. So we don't have time for that. We don't have time or room for that. Good question is, maybe they need to rejigger what they're doing. And I think that's probably going to be part of that report. I think we have probably time for one more question.
Hello? Yeah. So they gave me the mic and then you
Oh,
stood up. So
sorry.
I don't know whose question it is.
So 2 questions.
I'll stand up.
Yeah, we'll do two. We'll do yours and his, and then we'll stop. Sorry.
So my question was going to be about the online, but yeah, I think you covered that pretty well. So there's a lot of, if you look at K through 12, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's been kind of well known for decades. So for instance, direct instruction is a teaching technique, improves almost all kids' test scores by like 1/4 of a standard deviation or something like that. But if you actually go at the K through 12 to your county board and try to propose something like this, you'll face fierce opposition from teachers who will say direct instruction is really boring, and we don't want to, and they'll make up reasons on the fly about creativity as reasons not to use these kinds of techniques. So I just want to hear some comments on some of this low-hanging fruit that really hasn't been eaten up at the K through 12 level for something like 45 years, and what the prospects for any kind of deep education reform are when we've got so much of this stuff that maybe we've known since 1968 that we haven't done yet. Thank you.
Can we, I also said he could throw his question in. We probably won't have much time for answers, but the questions are good ones. Here comes the microphone. My apologies for not knowing you already had it.
Well, I'd rather not have an answer to this question. The question is really in two parts. Number one, how are you sure that you are recognizing the talent that you need within the company so that people are not falling through the cracks? And then how do you evaluate people to promote them?
Well, I think, I know we're up against the time. Let's go for a couple of quick answers. I think you two who are more on the employer side might jump on the second one and really quickly. And
yeah, I can just answer. I mean, quickly from a performance perspective, we actually have a standardized process. It's a 9-box that we look at. We measure performance, we measure potential. We do it a couple of times a year. And then from a recognition perspective, the people that are in those high potential boxes, well, there's clear direction on how you actually handle and manage those individuals within those boxes. So, it could be something as simple as giving people some exposure opportunities. It could give them a different rotation within the organization. It could be just, using them as a trusted professional. There's a lot of different action items that you can take as to where people actually sit within each one of those boxes, but it does help us understand where our future potential people are and what do we need to do to retain them, and then how do we measure against that.
And I'll just go to the earlier question about the low-hanging fruit. We do the 9-box also, and we tie it to succession planning and all that sort of stuff. My observation is, this isn't my observation. This is actually a guy named Jim Collins' observation. Jim's written a lot of business books, and he wrote From Good to Great and all that sort of thing. He's kind of turned his attention towards schools now. And he's, over the last 30 years of his business data career, he's kind of decided that great companies have great leaders. There's sort of a correlation there. What he's finding out is that great schools have great principals. So, last week I had a chance to talk to a member of the local school board, and I said, so what sort of professional development are you doing for your principals? And the answer was, well, we really don't do that. So, in my opinion, that's going to be something that we're going to go kind of figure out how do we probably have a little bit of cachet in our local communities. And so we might be able to help them figure out how to do professional development for principals to start to create some leverage in the classroom to allow those teachers to provide top shelf product for the consumers of education.
Time's up. I want to thank Mike, Nancy, and Mansour.